we are recording. Good morning, good day, and good evening. Welcome to episode, 180 something, 6, 7, something like that. I don't know. I've lost track at this point.
There's a number somewhere.
Yeah, it's in the 180s. I know that. Welcome to the show, Neal Gompa. How's it going? I know that you've been, involved in Flock, but I imagine a lot of people just didn't realize that you've shown your face before, because I only ever see the Detective Conan picture.
Yeah, so it's an interesting morning. It's the beginning of September. Technically it's the Labor Day over here in the US where I live. It's a nice day. I'll probably after this go outside for a nice walk and chillax a little bit.
It is 12:15 in the morning. I'm going to go to sleep after this.
Why the heck did you agree to this time?
I've done way worse than this. I have gone to sleep and woken up at 4 in the morning before to do podcasts with some people. Here's the thing, right? I don't just do the YouTube thing full time. I also have a job in a supermarket doing night filling work. Nothing important, is just whatever. I get home about 30 minutes before this, so for me, I'm still awake. It's not really a big deal.
So you're a night shift over.
Yeah.
You do a night shift thing.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So you've already switched your sleeping rhythms around for this.
Well,
for the most part.
Look, I try to get up at 8, 9 in the morning. So I'm going to get up.
What is wrong with you?
Look.
I realized you're in Australia, and I'm just this is why I was I don't know how we're I was totally okay with doing this in my evening, which would be your morning, and that would be way more legit.
It's fine. We're here now, so it's fine.
I thought, maybe Brody's just an Australian that happens to live somewhere closer, so he was okay with this. I was all right, sure, that's great. But no, you're an Australian in Australia talking to me at midnight. I'm oh my God.
Yeah, it's fine. Look. As I said, I've done way worse than this. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Oh my gosh! All right. Well, I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's fine. I'm just gonna sleep in tomorrow. It's fine. Not a big deal. So Neal, explain who you are and what you do for anyone who doesn't happen to know.
I don't know if there's a simple answer for that
I don't
question.
think there is. I've looked at your LinkedIn.
Yeah, so I guess the focus of your audience, I've kind of styled myself as a professional technologist. I'm also an open sourcer, or whatever title you want to use for that. I've been involved in Linux and open source in some form or fashion for 20 years. Or longer. And that, by the way, means that I've been doing this since I was a kid. So
wow.
I'm not old. and sometimes, though, I feel it when I talk to some of the people that get in and they're like, what is, they've never heard of some of the references I make, or a floppy disk or Windows 95. And I'm like, oh, I hurt, because I first used Windows 3.1. Anyway.
You know, there are some of those distro maintainers 15 years old. Some of them are on my Discord. I'm like, how are you a distro maintainer already?
I mean, to be fair, I got started when I was I started making Fedora remixes when I was 14, 15.
Wow.
So, yeah. So I've done that. I've done that as a kid. But no, I've been doing open source, Linux and open source stuff for 20 plus years. I actually got started, I think, in 2000, 2001. Yeah, it was 2001, because it was right after Windows XP became a thing. And that's how this is how you date me. Okay. I remember Windows XP.
I think my first computer we had was XP as well. Yeah.
So the first computer I had, that my family had, was actually an IBM PC XT running DOS. Yeah. And that was because when my dad worked from home for a while after my mom had me, they sent him a compuper to work from home. Right. And that was what he had. And then my first experiences with computers. So my dad was a math professor at in Indiana University, Kokomo. And I remember in my early birthdays, like he would get his office computer upgraded. I think it was like my 6th or 7th birthday. I forget which. That he got the computer outfitted with a CD-ROM drive and a sound card and a 2.1 sound speaker set, and like put on things like Reader Rabbit and whatever with multimedia. And I was like, oh wow. And yeah, and that eventually, when the university upgraded his computer again, they got that. They moved from Gateway to Dell, so they got a Dell Optiplex to replace his Gateway 2000 machine. He bought the Gateway 2000 machine from the university for like nothing, and then gave it to me, and it was my first computer. And I promptly tore it apart, did my own upgrades, and did my own things. It's like it came with Windows NT 4.0 on it. I wiped it and put Windows 95 on it. Then later I did a multi-boot with Windows NT and 98, which, by the way, is really hard because Windows NT doesn't know how to read FAT32. And then later on, like I started experimenting with Linux, and this is where like Red Hat Linux 6.2 out of a library book. Okay. The library book was actually for a different version of Red Hat Linux that didn't match the book. So, because the librarians obviously don't know what CD is what, and then so they put the wrong ones in, and thankfully they were the right, they were a full collection. So I wound up installing it, and I broke my computer, and that's how I got started with Linux.
So that's the release from 2000, then. So
I think Red Hat Linux 6.2 was like 98 or 99, but again, I did this in like 2000.
Yeah, I'm looking at the release list. If it is 6.2, that's 6.2 Zoot in April 3rd, 2000. It may have been another one, or you may just be getting the timeline wrong.
No, if that's right, then it still fits within the window of like, hey, this is when I did stuff.
Right.
And I started with Red Hat Linux and broke my computer multiple times, upgraded through that all the way to 9, and then Fedora, the Fedora, when Red Hat Linux 10 was canceled, then went to Fedora Core, I followed on that chain. But anyway, like I started all the way back then as a user using this stuff, following into Fedora, and actually even, going to Ubuntu. Like Ubuntu in like, I think my first version of Ubuntu was Ubuntu 504 Breezy Badger. For a long time, I could actually say all the ones in sequence. I could remember all the code names and actually say them. I don't know if I could pull that off right now, but that was definitely a thing for a long time that I could do. But yeah, so then I was dual Ubuntu Fedora for a long time, all the way up until college, when I stopped using Ubuntu, because in about 2011 or so, then they introduced Unity, and it was kind of a mess. Like the experience was good, and I wound up actually using it for like family computers and whatever. And especially was great because it was the only 10-foot-ish UI that was available on Linux out of the box, and so we would use it for the family computer connected to the TV. But I wound up having problems like maintaining Ubuntu systems back then, and it was just, and at the time it was also like really difficult to talk to Canonical folks and Ubuntu folks to get things to be improved. And so I kind of moved away from it back to like being full-time Fedora. And this kind of coincided with me graduating from college and then getting into my professional career, which cemented me just using Fedora day to day for everything and contributing to it. And a few years later, I started contributing to OpenSUSE. My first usage of SUSE distributions actually dates all the way back to around the same time I started trying to use Ubuntu. Helpfully, the installer crashed. I think it was SUSE Linux 9.1. I want to say it was either 8.0 or 9.1. I forget which one. But it helpfully crashed from English into German. And it was like this yellow on red that I couldn't read. And it's just like, well, okay, clearly this doesn't work. And I tried a few times, I think, even all the way up until I finally gave up with 10.0. It's like, okay, clearly SUSE is not made for me because this keeps happening. And, but like, yeah. So that's like, I've used Debian-ish, Red Hat-ish, SUSE-ish distributions for almost 20 years now. And I started contributing them about 15-ish years ago to Fedora, and I pretty much haven't stopped. It's just grown in scope and whatever. And then for SUSE, for OpenSUSE, I started poking at it like I think it was 10, 11, 12 years ago, and then started actually contributing to it about 10 years ago. And I've kind of kept doing it ever since. And in that time frame, I've jumped from many different distributions. I've used Red Hat-ish, SUSE, Debian-ish, as I said. But I've also used things like Gentoo, Arch, Mandriva, and that's how I kind of got into Magia as well many years ago, an Open Mandriva as well, and some of their offshoots. So I've kind of been a little bit all over the place, partly because of stuff that I've used, but also like I genuinely feel excited about open source and being involved in it and helping people. Like I look at open source as my way of leveraging the skills and knowledge and capabilities I have to help benefit the world. So I have a very altruistic streak when it comes to how I look at open source software. So part of that means that like I try to help people, which means I wind up doing things that I wouldn't actually. I work on things that I don't use a lot, which makes me a weirdo because in most cases in open source, people only really work on things that they use or compelled to deal with. I just do all the things all the time.
I don't know how many people that you've talked to about like how they got into Linux, but with people from like your era, whatever generation, whatever term you want to use for it, it's always a very similar story. It's like, okay, I started on Red Hat Linux. I eventually started using Ubuntu. It wasn't something because like Ubuntu was offering like a more like desktop friendly experience, better for the hardware you're using, something along those lines, I would assume. And then when Unity comes out, it's like, well,
okay. So like, it's not that I dislike the Unity experience. I think that it was a major step forward. When the GNOME experience came out, it was actually my point of basically like when the GNOME experience and the Unity experience came out, it was very obvious that they were comparable. There were some similarities there. The difference between the two was that it felt like Unity was actually like targeting a real person. Like I felt like when I was using it, it's like, oh, there's things here. People are thinking about what I want to use. Things feel slightly integrated. It's like a thing. GNOME has for a long time felt to me like just somebody's vision of how people think they should use it. Like in some respects, very close to the Apple-esque approach,
right?
Without the pull to make them really something people wanted, like everyone wanted. But I've bounced back and forth between, for example, KDE, XFC, Mate, GNOME, Cinnamon. I eventually settled onto KDE Plasma with Plasma towards the end of Plasma 4, and then into Plasma 5. I actually joined the Fedora KDE SIG just shortly after we started shipping Plasma 5, and sort of kind of by default took over the SIG because I was the last man standing on a lot of the stuff. So that sort of happened.
Yeah.
But like I used to use GNOME too, and I really liked that experience back then. And when Ubuntu moved to Unity and Fedora moved to GNOME 3, well, GNOME didn't stay on my computers for very long, and because it was really not complete,
right?
And it was a very painful experience. But Unity, while the reason I essentially stopped using Ubuntu over it wasn't because I disliked the Unity experience per se. I thought it was great. The problem was that Ubuntu was horribly unstable all the time. Like I was actually having failed distribution upgrades, package updates going wrong, applications getting borked because of patches in GTK and stuff like that to make it all work. Like it superficially looked integrated and was a very clean experience. But when you started putting things into it, it started like falling apart very quickly. And it was just not something I wanted to tolerate all the time. So I moved away from it, and for a while I used Cinnamon, and then Mate, and then eventually I landed on KDE Plasma.
I guess it kind of makes sense why Ubuntu was really weird during that era, because they were very much trying to work out, like, can we not just be a computer operating system, but can we be something in the smartphone space? They had like the whole Ubuntu phone. There was the Ubuntu TV stuff, which hardly anybody remembers. There was the Ubuntu tablet as well, which was separate from the phone thing. They were doing all of these things at the exact same time. And
I backed the phone.
oh, you did? Wow.
I did.
Why? Because that phone was nonsense. It had. I've read the specs. The specs are literally nonsense. They don't make any sense.
I backed the phone because back then I was actually I was a telecom wonk back
Right.
then, and I was really in the cellular and mobile space. But I also wanted to see something more aligned to what I cared about.
Yeah, yeah.
And Ubuntu Touch was something that I was excited about.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark Shuttleworth put up that, I think it was an Indiegogo, or
yeah, it was an Indiegogo. Yes.
Yeah, and I backed it.
No, I get it. It sounds really cool.
Yeah, I backed it, and then they didn't, but they gave me my money back, which was actually like, oh, okay, well, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is in contrast with another one that I backed a few years later, where I still haven't gotten my money back, and I have no anything, and I just, oh man, and I backed way more money for that one.
I've talked about this before, but I just need to remind people just how ridiculous the Ubuntu Edge phone was. It was such a cool concept.
Yeah.
So the iPhone 5, 1 gig of RAM, Samsung Galaxy S4, 2 gigs, Ubuntu Edge, 4 gigs. Okay. Galaxy S4, 16 gigs of storage, iPhone 5, 64, Ubuntu Edge, 128 gigs.
Those are not crazy today, but 10 years ago, they were nuts.
Yeah, especially the 128 gig internal storage. The screen wasn't that crazy. The screen was actually a lower res than what the S4 had at the time. That was a 1080p screen. This was only going to be 720.
Well, to be fair, Samsung manufactures their own displays, and they were keeping all the best stuff for themselves back then.
That is absolutely fair, yes. The rest of it is all totally normal. Stereo speaker, though. I wish more phones had those.
I still don't know a phone that has a stereo speaker.
There was a couple of HTC phones that came out like years back, but I don't know why it never became standard.
I guess it's because it's really difficult to do it properly, like auditorily. Like, having spatial audio on a phone means that essentially you got to have speakers in two places.
Right.
Aside from the circuitry nightmare that's going to create, how does it make a phone call sound? How does it make there's a lot of times they reuse the speaker that's used for phone calls.
I would assume you just swap it into mono for a phone call. You just cut off one of the speakers.
That would make sense, but some people be crazy.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There are people that walk around with speakers like glued to their chests. So hey.
That is weird. I
hate those people. Stop it. Just get earphones. You go to any store, there'll be earphones there for like a couple of dollars.
And also nowadays, headphones and earphones and earbuds especially are now so good at spatial audio that you don't need a jukebox strapped to your back and chest. You really don't.
No.
Also, no one needs to hear it.
No, really don't. Or if you want it to be like, if you don't have something in your ear, you can get bone conductive earphones. They just stick on your face.
So interesting. I haven't used one of those.
I've not used them, but they look cool.
I want to.
I don't think they're that expensive anymore either.
Yeah, they used to be like thousands of dollars. They must. But yeah.
Let's see. Bone conduction headphones. Let's see. The best bone conduction headphones of 2023. Thank you, Tech Radar. What do you? You can give me a price? No. Okay, we'll just click this one. $200.
Oh, so that's right in line with high-end headphones.
Yeah. Oh, that's 200 Australian. So I don't know what that is in real money.
In real money, that's probably maybe 180 or something like that.
I think our dollar's way worse than that. It's like 150.
Wow, I was being generous.
Yeah, our dollar's not great. Our dollar's definitely not great. How did we get here? We'll talk about Unity and then Ubuntu Edge phone.
You got to the phone.
Yeah, and then they also had the Ubuntu TV stuff, which that was really cool.
I never saw anything, but it was very cool. But also the Ubuntu TV is essentially scaling up the Unity UI for television. And that always made sense to me because I actually did that. My personal, I used to own a 55-inch television before I moved to where I live now, when I was in college and whatever, I had a big TV and whatever, but I connected it to a computer and I used the Unity UI for it because it made sense. So to me, that whole concept always made sense, but I never saw anything come out of it. Well, I don't know if anything ever did.
There was a CES demo, 2012, 2011, whenever they first like showed it off. Then there was a bunch of news stories that came out after that. People were like, hey, this is so cool. This is exciting. Open source TVs. A year later, like, and
Nothing.
Canonical still doesn't have system integrators.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, this is going nowhere.
Yep.
But that's the problem they have. They just, because by that point, Android TV was in like early stages, but still existed. Apple TV was in early stages, but still existed. And then Canonical comes along doing their thing. So it's like, okay, but how do you compete with Google and Apple, who already got something established in this market and already had partners? Like, that was going to be so difficult to overcome.
I think it would have been less difficult to overcome than people realize, because the actual key problem, and this is always dogged, even desktop Linux, is that multimedia consumption on Linux is a pain. And if you like an Ubuntu TV, for it to be actually usable, would need to have partnerships with media providers to provide integration so that those services would work.
Yeah,
we were at the beginnings of the streaming content era.
Yeah.
And not having a Netflix and a YouTube app built into Ubuntu TV, and not having like some of the other burgeoning content things all worked out, that probably like made it difficult for them to get partnerships with TV makers.
When it comes,
it's not like the TV makers want to make their own software if they don't have to.
Yeah, for sure. With the app, one of the things I think did act as a barrier to entry for that is they wanted the Unity UI to be like the I guess the single UI for accessing the content. They didn't want to have like, you load into the Netflix app, it's its own UI. You load into the YouTube app, it's its own UI. And I think that level of
killed it.
You're taking that kind of control away from those companies. They just didn't really have that interest.
Yeah, nobody has that interest.
Like, it makes sense in the open source space, but trying to convince Netflix to do it, it just wasn't going to happen.
It makes sense in every space, but commercially it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Because like the reason you would do that is so that you have a pattern. You maximize Fitts law. You're able to give people something to work with and understand what's going on. That's incredibly important. But companies don't want to. They would like to have distinct interfaces, distinct experiences. They want to be memorable and they want to be sticky. And so everybody tries to do something a little different so that they can be distinct.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense. One of the things you mentioned along your like early journey was dual booting Ubuntu and Fedora at the same time. Why were you doing that rather than just sticking with one or the other? If you happen to remember.
I do. I'm trying to think about how to phrase this.
Okay.
Ubuntu was great for the consumption side of things.
Right.
Because like it was you got to remember the context of this. At this time, Wi-Fi was still difficult on Linux. So it was great for consumption. It was an easy mode that I needed if I needed to get quickly into my computer and do stuff. But my passion and my interest in actually like doing stuff for real was always in Fedora. And so I kept both because I wanted to see if I could make it so I could use one fully. And so Ubuntu was a distribution that I really couldn't get involved in and I couldn't really get engaged in. And it was very closed off for me as someone who exists outside of the purview of the core Ubuntu team.
Right.
And that is still kind of true even today. Although they're a little bit more open now than they used to be, it's ultimately still Canonical's decisions about what goes on into everything. Right. Even the community flavors are subject to that. Yeah. Right. The excising of Flatpak from all the flavors recently was an example of this, right? So the model that Fedora has is more forgiving and more community centric. There's this, again, this kind of boils down to the philosophies between Canonical and Red Hat. So if you look at Red Hat's philosophy, there's this distinction of a project and a product. And this distinction manifests in several key ways. The most important key way is that projects are not tightly coupled to the company decisions. Products are. And so you see projects taking lives of their own and getting more stakeholders and becoming more neutral over time. They don't start out that way, but they grow to be more neutral over time. And Red Hat, in some respects, is essentially a dispassionate investor that essentially keeps a project afloat. And that model maximizes community engagement and participation and support. And then you look at things like, the different spins and remixes and stuff like that, right? Most recently, I did the Fedora Asahi remix.
Oh,
but
were you involved? Right, I know you're in the SIG now, but were you?
I made the SIG.
Oh, you made the SIG. Oh, you just forgot to list it. Okay.
I forgot to list it until a couple weeks ago.
Oh, so you're the guy to thank for that. I didn't realize that.
Well, so in the Asahi Linux announcement, they mention me by name, which by the way is still a weird
forgot
feeling.
to read it. I'm sure I heard about it.
Yeah, so I created it. I created the SIG, and I helped create. I helped with a friend of mine, Davida Kalvika. We got all the software pulled into Fedora and getting it integrated, and then I made the image descriptions, and I work on the tooling along with Davida and a few others to actually build it out. But that's something that is super easy to do in Fedora because all the tooling is open, all the infrastructure is open, all the possibilities are open. Whereas, and this is also all the different spins that exist: the Fedora KDE spin, Fedora Kinoite. You see the Cinnamon, XFC, the LXQt, all the labs, Python Classroom, Astronomy, Games Lab.
If you try to listen to that, you're going to hear all night.
We'll be here all night. Yes, there's a lot of them. I think we're up to almost 30 deliverables. I don't know, man. There's a lot. There's a lot. I am not even talking about the containers and the cloud images and all the variants. There's a lot going on there. But because of that product split, so Red Hat Enterprise Linux is very, very small compared to Fedora. There's I think a 20th of the packages, 10th or a 20th of the packages. The deliverables are considerably smaller. RHEL doesn't provide live images. RHEL doesn't provide other desktops anymore. They used to have KDE. I'm super sad that they got rid of it. I would love to see it come back again someday. They don't have Btrfs. Btrfs is amazing. Again, I hope it comes back someday. But they make choices of their own. And Fedora is not required to follow Red Hat in that respect. There are obviously a few guardrails. But again, Red Hat acts more as a dispassionate investor in the project, sponsored by Red Hat. And that's a very important thing. Whereas if you look at Ubuntu, it is a canonical product that also manifests itself as a project. But because they are one and the same brand, they are one in the same community, one in the same thing, Canonical ultimately has to exert tremendous influence and control because that's the thing that they're pitching. That's the thing that they're selling. That's the thing that they're building their business on directly. Because and this strategy also makes sense because ultimately Ubuntu is derived from Debian. Right? In the early days, in the very beginning, and I think it's still true even now. If you go look at contributing Ubuntu stuff, they will tell you, go to Debian. I've contributed to Debian. That is a whole process in itself.
In regards to that, I don't think a lot of people realize how much of Debian nowadays is canonical employees actually contributing upstream to Debian.
Well, and again, this comes back to the project product split thing, because Ubuntu's input is exclusively Debian with some exceptions. The way that even canonical employees do stuff, so for example, the GNOME stack in Debian is essentially maintained by canonical employees. So GNOME gets upgraded on Ubuntu's schedule in Debian and then imported from Debian back into Ubuntu.
Right.
So things like that, things that they care about in Ubuntu that they as a team maintain. Like I don't know this for certain. It's been a while since I've last checked, but I believe one of the kernel maintainers for Debian is actually a canonical employee who happens to also maintain the Ubuntu kernel. And so they do some work shared between the two. There's other stuff like this, like some packages, of course, that are things that like NetPlan and whatever, like they maintain those in Ubuntu, but to do that, they also have to maintain it in Debian. And like, even though there's they're maintaining their own packaging for Ubuntu, they are required to have a package in Debian. So they have a very, they don't consider Ubuntu, at least in their actions. I don't know if that's how they feel about it, like in words or say, but I don't think they consider Ubuntu distinctly a project in its own right. It's more of a productization of Debian, which I think is a fair characterization of it. But the problem is the Debian's toolings is pretty antiquated, and it's really, if you think like it's, I know some people have made the comment of like, oh, Fedora's infrastructure is all like loosely coupled and like kind of arcane and difficult to follow. I'm like, man, it can be so much worse. It can be so much worse. It could be better, but it could also be worse. And I, in my view, like seeing how things work in Debian, I feel like Debian is worse because the way that Debian does things is that each individual maintainer has essentially total control of how that package is maintained.
Right.
They can choose to not use source control. They don't have to use Git or SVN or Mercurial or whatever. They can just upload stuff right into the to what they call the archive. Right. And the FTP masters, which is a team that manages uploads from Debian developers and maintainers, checks it over and then imports it into the repositories. They don't care how it's produced, as long as they give them the required inputs, the required artifacts. So I've had to deal with Debian packages that have no version control. I've had to deal with Debian packages that have weird version control, because it's just not. There's no consistency requirements for Debian. That's how worse you can get. Anyway, so Ubuntu, I think, doesn't feel it's as, and because of this distinction of Ubuntu versus Fedora, right? I've always felt like I've had more ownership of my platform in Fedora than Ubuntu, and so I've always leaned a little bit more towards Fedora. But I'm also a pragmatist in the sense that, like, if something is going to work in a particular context or an environment, and I really can't use what I prefer there, I will use the other thing instead. Right. And so for a long time, I wound up using Ubuntu for stuff where nothing else worked, because that was what worked. I always tried to use it as an opportunity to learn to see if I can fix my thing too. And that's kind of how we got started doing all these things in multiple distributions. Eventually, one of the things that I came to figure out was that if I wanted to do something well, if I wanted to do something right, I have to provide the maximally useful, minimal viable solution. And the way that works is I have to think about the different distributions that I use and work with and interface with. And I think about the solutions I'm making and see what the requirements of all the different ones are before I make something. And then I go make something and put it in all of them. Because if I don't do it that way, what winds up happening is you create these little islands of inconsistency, and you create these different you get these different ways of solving the problem in different thought processes, not necessarily in a way that multiple, like the whole community can benefit, but only some communities can benefit. And so, like, for example, Fedora's multimedia stuff, that's actually, I took a good chunk of what I did in Fedora from OpenSUSE. And then the improvements I did in Fedora I ported back to OpenSUSE. Right. And so, like, for me, it's not about making just one platform better or the other. It's about making the whole community benefit from all the stuff. And so whenever I try to make something, like, I'm not going to go out super crazy and go do it for everybody. Like, there's just too much Linux for that.
Sure, there's only so much time in the day.
Yeah. But I will try to at least have more than one that, so I try to make something. I try to make things that work for Fedora and OpenSUSE at least, and see if I can extend it further, or at least I'll talk to other people and say, like, hey, this is something I did across more than one distribution. Do you think this could help for you and whatever? And as it turns out, when you build something that's in more than one distribution already, if it's in 2, it's easier to get it to 3, to then 4, to then 8, to then all of them.
Right.
So you can accelerate that snowball effect and that network effect. An example of this was, I think it was like almost 6 years ago or something like that. I made the change in Fedora from the old package config implementation. So the package config is a tool that you use in development to be able to find out compiler flags for using a library or a module or something for building a project. We use this all the time all over the place in Linux land. There are multiple implementations of package config.
Mm-hmm.
So the one that Fedora was using was some old version that was originally made by Debian and then part of GNOME and then part of Free Desktop. It's all over the place. Wasn't super actively maintained. Kind of a pain to work with and customize. And at the time, I was looking at, like, how can I make it easier for me to support more features and more capabilities, and also to be able to bootstrap into new architectures and platforms. Package config had a recursive bootstrap problem, which was not great. And so taking that out was important. Well, there was this implementation, another implementation of package config called PackageConf, PKGCONF. And I met the maintainer, the developer of it.
So that was from 2017-ish? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I found the wiki page.
Yep. And the maintainer, who now is Ariadne, the lead of Alpine.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, so she created, back then she hadn't transitioned and I knew her by a different name, but that's not important. But like, so if you find references to an old name in there, it's because, well, I'm trying not to dead name, but if you look up the history and go through it,
sure. If
you will be confused
from 6 years ago, yeah.
But Ariadne, who created Alpine and APK, and also created PackageConf, and so I worked with her to, like, address any things that I felt that we needed for Fedora, and then we swapped the implementation. Then I introduced it in OpenSUSE, and I got them to swap the implementation. And then I did it in Magia, and I got them to swap the implementation. And after 3, essentially all the major distributions had swapped. And we'd gotten to a point now that people were just on their own switching. So then OpenMandriva did it, and then Debian finally, I think it was like a couple of years ago, they finally pulled the trigger on it. There's a whole other set of background reasons for why it took so long for Debian. Not going to get into it, but they did it finally, and so PackageConf has essentially replaced package config. It's also started replacing it in BSDs too, because it's not. I'm a copyleft guy. Ariadne is not so much. So she wrote it and licensed it in a permissive license. BSD people like permissive licenses, so it was an easy win for them. So that's kind of like, that was my first real experience doing that. I was like, oh, this works. And so I just started doing it for everything. And like the Btrfs stuff that we did that I've done in Fedora with a bunch of other people, like several years later in 2020 for Fedora, was very much inspired by not only the experiences I had during my day job at the time from dealing with ZFS and Btrfs, but also from using OpenSUSE, doing my own experiments working with Btrfs, and coming up with the right way to adopt it, and building on that to put it in. Obviously, the implementation of Btrfs and Fedora is different from OpenSUSE because there's a number of things that I left out on purpose. Things like the automatic snapshotting and whatever, because figuring out the schemes for doing that is highly distro specific. And so like the SUSE implementation of this doesn't work on Fedora, not completely. So there's adaptations and other stuff you have to deal with. But it's always been a goal to be able to get to a point where we can have full system snapshotting and stuff like that. But you have to start somewhere. And so that was the starting somewhere. And again, every solution I've worked on so far has been like, let's try to reduce the differences. Let's try to improve things. I introduced DNF as an alternative package manager in Magia in like 2015, 2016. And I also introduced it in OpenSUSE, I think, a few years after that.
Mm-hmm.
On all of my OpenSUSE and Magia systems, I use DNF instead of, in the case of OpenSUSE, Zipper, in the case of Magia, URPMI. I actually, from that experience, was able to help the Open Mandriva guys move from URPMI to DNF, which then led to Rosa moving to DNF and a bunch of other distributions moving to, I think, like Open Mamba moved to DNF. There was a few others that, like, I apparently wound up becoming the de facto guy of like, how do you move an RPM packet distribution to DNF? And it's happened a lot. Like I also helped the Yocto folks move from Smart, which was an old unmaintained package manager, written by the guy who created Snaps. Yeah, so Gustavo Niemeyer, when he was at Connectiva, later Mandriva, he made a successor to apt RPM called Smart. And the reason why was because apt RPM was a pain in the butt to develop and maintain. And at the time, this was like 17 years ago or something like that, the Debian people refused, out of principle, to consider having an RPM backend for apt. Just flat out just said no.
Right.
And there was all kinds of weird, funky politics, and I think most of it's not written down. I got fun stories from the people that were involved in it over the years.
It's always fun when stuff like that is just littered over the mailing list. But it's not written down like that. That takes away all my fun.
Yeah, but they just straight up wouldn't consider it. They didn't want it, and so like apt RPM wound up being a very difficult to maintain fork.
Mm-hmm.
And so Gustavo Niemeyer then went and tried to solve the problem by making a brand new package manager that supported multiple different repo sources, different package manager types. Like I think back in the beginning, it was like Slackware and RPM and Debian. And I think now it supports I want to say it supports Arch packages. It's still a very dead project now, but like at some point, somebody added Arch packages, I think, to the mix. I don't remember anymore. It's been a long time. But anyway, Gustavo Niemeyer made that. And that was what brought him to Canonical eventually. And though Ubuntu was originally planning on adopting Smart, there was a kind of a revolt about it. And so they didn't do it. I don't know more details about that. But I assume
that's related to the Debian stuff in some way?
Probably. So they didn't adopt Smart, but Gustavo stayed at Canonical, and eventually, I think it's like, I don't know, it's like a few years later, he made Clicks and Snaps, and now the dude's the CTO of Canonical.
Oh, wait.
So
I thought I'd heard that name.
Yeah, Gustavo Niemeyer. I remember the few Canonical employees I've known at the time that used to call him the Mark Whisperer, and I guess, that's very true. He's now the CTO, so he gets to work with them all day.
Yeah, I knew that name had shown up. Yeah, okay, wow. Jeez.
I've been all over, man. I used to be involved very early on in the Snap project. I was the Snap format oversight board, which we didn't really do much. I think the only thing we actually managed to do was get them to use SPDX notation for license tags. Mm-hmm. I think that was it. We got them to do license tags, and we got them to be upstream compatible, sort of. Mm-hmm. I think that was it. We didn't get to do much else, but I was involved in the Snap project. I helped make Snapd work on Fedora. Mm-hmm. I was effectively the maintainer of the Snap system in Fedora for many, many years. I still technically am nominally the maintainer of it. And I still occasionally do stuff for it, but it's a lot of it kind of goes on its own kind of thing now.
Is there even like that many people interested in Snapd on Fedora in the first place?
In the beginning, there was a lot of it. And also there was a big part of like, you don't know which horse to bet on, and you don't want to be on the losing horse. And you also want to always have some influence on every horse that's involved in the race.
Right.
So there was obviously a lot of people who were interested in Flatpak because it was a Red Hat project, and Red Hatters control the workstation working group, which drive that part. So it's, of course, the whole thing. It's also GNOME associated, whole other set of things, right? But Canonical did something that made Snaps more viable. Mm-hmm. That was that they reached out to commercial entities and got them to put their Snaps in the Snap store. So at that point in time, I was a little worried that we were going to get locked out if we didn't have something in place. And it's not like the snap system is all bad. Like there are things I don't like about it, but one of the things I do like about it is that the developer experience is way nicer than any other universal packaging format. Snapcraft is a pretty good experience compared to, say, Flatpak Builder or the App Image Builder and all those other things. They really put some thought into that. But because they were building these professional snaps that are available in the Snap Store, it's like, well, we got to be able to access them. Like, we have to have access to that content.
We have serious projects in here like Slack and Spotify and the JetBrains stuff's in here as well, and all of this other, like, big things people recognize.
Right. And I'd been to a couple of those sprints where representatives of those companies were working with Canonical hand in hand to make and maintain them, right? So, like, I don't think that was a wrong choice for me to make sure that snaps worked well in Fedora, because I didn't know then which one was going to win out. And more importantly, Flatpak still hasn't won. None of those companies that are making snaps now are making Flatpaks. For whatever reason. They're not doing it. So I think it was still the right choice to do that, and it makes sense for us to be in that space to make sure that we are able to do that.
I totally get.
I was going to.
Sorry. I was going to say. I totally get, like, having it be in that space. I was more curious about, like, because I'm not involved, like, in much of the Fedora community. I'm sort of watching it from the outside. Like, how much of the, like, user interest there is in snaps in the first place.
I think at the beginning there was a lot more of it. It kind of died down over time as the continued pressure and marketing attention. Like, somebody finally figured out that Flatpak needed to be marketed.
Sure.
And FlatHub too. And so that eventually started. I think that started. Defaults matter, and Fedora Workstation with Flatpak out of the box and an easy button to activate FlatHub was a big deal. And and then, like, there were spats with people who were maintaining GNOME software. There were spats with people upstream. There was it was a whole mess that made my life as the snap system maintainer in Fedora a little bit more difficult than it needed to be. But I still know people who use snaps in Fedora. Like, I mean, some of my colleagues in the past, like, they use Fedora, but they also use snaps because that's the way to get those things.
Right.
It is what it is. Like, from the Flatpak side, I think Red Hat making a long-term stable Flatpak runtime, making that available for people to build software freely on it, and making it available, say, on FlatHub, getting the desktop software that's included in RHEL into their universal base image stuff, that will make a big difference if they decide to do it. Like, I know there's been hints and rumors about it for years. I don't know if they'll actually pull it off at some point. If they do, I think it'll be the tipping point that'll make companies want to build commercial Flatpaks, because the problem with Flatpaks right now is long-term support for an application. A commercial application is required, just flat out required. You can't not have that. But community, the FlatHub community just isn't equipped to do that. They don't have, and the free desktop runtime is not aimed for that. It is just not. So you've got to have something for that. Red Hat makes a Flatpak runtime. They build Flatpak apps on that runtime. It's in the Red Hat catalog. And if you are a RHEL subscriber, whether you have a free one or a paid one, you have access to those apps. But I haven't seen much beyond, Red Hat produced stuff. We'll see how that goes. Maybe they'll make a big push with RHEL 10, which is coming in a couple of years. But who knows?
Who knows? Maybe. Look, it could happen. It would be cool. It definitely would be cool.
I hope they do, because, like, I want Red Hat to do something more engaging in the desktop space,
right?
And in the in the professional desktop space, there's a lot on that pie that they're not slicing up and taking on. So there's definitely some stuff that they could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the professional desktop space really, like, it's really weird because you've got like this massive amount of systems that it's focused on, like, just, hobby, individual stuff. And then you got Red Hat, you got SUSE, you got all of that doing like the big serious stuff. But nobody's really targeting that
The middle?
middle point there.
Yeah. Well, I think SUSE is probably the closest. They have SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop,
Right.
which is essentially, or SLED, as they like to call it.
That's what they call it. Please,
Yep.
please don't call it that. That's not a good name.
You're sledding on Linux. It's fine.
Sure. Okay. I guess, Penguin, all that stuff.
Yep, sure. SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop is an offering that they have. You can go to their website, SUSE.com/shop, and it actually shows up there. You can buy it. I think it's like $150 a year for it. It's not a lot. And you get a desktop that is supported, and you can do stuff with it.
I hope you can do stuff with it. For $150
I hope you can do stuff with it too. But like, it exists on there. Red Hat used to have an equivalent called Red Hat Enterprise Linux Desktop. They took it out. They killed it in RHEL 8, and they moved more high end. But SUSE still has a mid-range product as well as a high end one. And I think, like, I wish the awareness for these, like, if you go to redhat.com/store or SUSE.com/shop, you actually can purchase subscriptions for paid Linux desktop offerings, or Linux workstation, or whatever you want to call it, right? And that gives you an opportunity to not only use a supported platform, if in a professional context, that can be important, but you're also essentially funding and supporting the stuff that they're already doing, and you're also telling with your dollars that this matters. I mean, it's like GNOME. If you like GNOME, sure, you can donate to the GNOME Foundation. GNOME Foundation don't pay for anybody to develop anything. That's mostly done by Red Hat and SUSE engineers, with Collabora and Purism also on the side there. So, yeah, like, there's a lot going on there, and it's just so hidden, and we don't talk about it a lot because we're always excited about the community free Linux stuff, because the community Linux stuff is where all the cool stuff happens, and there's just so much to go on about. And the enterprise space is supposed to be boring. I don't know if boring is the way I would describe the past 3 years of enterprise Linux, but like, it's supposed to be
3 months, really.
Oh man, the last 3 months have been horrible.
Yeah. But no, you are right.
But like,
you are right. Ever since the CentOS stuff, that's it's been fun times. Fun times.
Yes, it has been a very exciting time, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. At least people now know it exists.
Yeah, that's true. Good. Any publicity is good publicity. Anyone who says that's stupid, but say it.
I don't think that's a true statement.
It's definitely not. No.
But yeah, like, this kind of goes back to the thing is, like, the desktop space is very interesting. And I've always been very mindful that this is a space that is undervalued and underworked on. So I've increasingly put a lot of effort towards it, because my belief is that with open source, you have two choices. You can either pay with effort and knowledge and contribution, or you can pay with money. So I do both, but where I have the capability to do something meaningful, I pay with effort and time and contributions. But where I can't, I'm happy to give money to worthy projects that I use and love and want to support. And I encourage other people to take the same tack, because that's the only way that this world gets any better. Like, we talk a lot about sustainability in open source, And like for all the screw ups in Red Hat's messaging around CentOS, I think it's important to note that like if Red Hat Enterprise Linux as a product was not being eaten away by RHEL derivatives that are freely available, it is quite likely they'd be doing a whole lot more in this space than they are now. Because they would have the revenue and the justification to do stuff in there. There's a whole long series of events that I've heard from many people, because at one point, in one of my previous jobs, one of my coworkers was the former GM of SUSE. I got to hear all kinds of stories, it is a wild world in the early 2000s. It's just like, I think I'm glad I was ignorant of most of this, because I don't think that this would have made me a very sad person if I knew this during that time. But I look at what's going on in there, and I'm just like, yeah, I love free Linux, but I also like put my heart and soul into the community operating systems and do a lot in there, because that's how I give back, and that's how I support those communities. I think people need to understand that like nothing comes for free, and that's really difficult for some people to grasp, especially now that we've been 20 years of open source. Open source hasn't won, but it's certainly everywhere. And that might actually be the saddest fact of all.
I think the only concern, not the only, the major concern people had with all the CentOS stuff, and then the recent stuff that happened with Red Hat, is the fact that it just happened. I'm sure they had a lot of conversation internally, but what it was shown to the public, it just happened suddenly. It's not okay. So until there's a 6-month grace period, a next release grace period, anything like that. It's just this goes back to what you're saying with the messaging around it was a bit rough. Obviously people are going to be angry no matter what happens, but if there's some sort of grace period there, I'm sure it would have gone over a lot less aggressively.
Well, the Red Hatters were surprised too, so
yeah, okay. You are right about the messaging then.
If you isn't it many Red Hatters, talking in social media or in IRC or in Matrix or wherever, they're upfront about the fact that they didn't know either. And they've all got their own opinions about it, but everyone is surprised.
Yeah.
So, the other thing is you got to remember that Red Hat's made of a lot of people. And while Red Hat's not this big faceless blob, it's a lot of blobs with faces and then some small group of faceless blobs.
Yeah.
So it's hard.
Well, I always try to make it clear whenever I do talk about the Red Hat stuff, the engineers, the people out there that are doing that work on these projects, they are not the ones making these decisions in corporate. I recently had Glorious Eggroll on the show. I've had Matthew Miller on the show. I'm sure there are other Red Hat people that I'm blanking on right now that I've had on the show. You're not at Red Hat right now, so you don't technically count. But you were at Red Hat. But I try to make it very clear that when I talk about the Red Hat stuff, the people in enterprise, the people who are making those financial decisions, those are not the people that are in the Gnome project, that are in the Fedora project. They're in all of these projects doing awesome things. They're just trying to make really cool code and really cool projects. Don't blame them for for the decisions that corporate either needs to make or feels like they need to be making.
But it also comes back to the other part of this, which is, I mentioned earlier about, you either pay with effort or you pay with money. A lot of people choose to do neither.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a real problem. It's a huge problem that users don't like. Users of open source software just don't get. They don't understand it because they look at it like any other, the formal, U.S. government term. I worked in a defense adjacent thing, so I know this term is COTS, commercial off the shelf software. They look at like it's, for a lot of companies, they define open source and proprietary vendors in the same bucket. It just happens to be the cost for an open source solution is often zero. And maybe there's a preference for an open source system, but they don't truly understand what that means. And they don't, it's very complicated stuff, but like they don't choose to do it, put anything back into supporting the things that support them.
Right.
And it's a very big problem that has led to a ton of challenges in various spaces in open source. But it's the biggest place that I think it hurts the most is in the desktop Linux space, where it's more labor of love than it is some kind of commercial venture. While it's true that a huge chunk of desktop Linux developers are paid, even more of them are not.
Yeah. I can't speak on any specific cases on desktop Linux, but I know there have been cases of developers of massive JavaScript libraries who, like, some of these libraries being used by, like, Amazon, eBay, like, some of these massive platforms. And I'm sure you've heard some of the stories of people that just like, you know what? I'm just sick. I'm just done with this. I'm not gonna.
Yep.
I'm not gonna support this anymore. If these companies are gonna use this and not do anything, like not support, not send anything upstream, not donate like small amount, like anything at all. Like why? Like I get it. I get the doing the everything is a labor of love. But at the end of the day, you need to pay your rent. And if
you need food,
if you can't pay your bills, like it's all well and good to say that it would be great if everybody could just do this like out of love and just enjoy every moment of what they're doing, but that's just not the world we live in. Like at the end of the day, you have bills you have to pay.
I want that world so bad, though. Imagine it, like, yeah, no, I've never been paid in my like. Outside of some very brief spurts where like open source and professional day job work has like overlapped a little bit, I've actually been never paid for my open source work. All of the open source work I do, nights and weekends, side contributions, nothing for like most of my jobs, just nope. Sometimes they align a few times, but the majority of it doesn't. And it's been that way for me ever since I started doing this. I have never found that magical moment. Like there have been people that are super lucky and they've got this magical moment where the thing that they enjoy doing, they get to get paid to do it, and it just supercharges their success. And I'm so happy for them. I have never been that fortunate. And a lot of people are even less fortunate than I am. It is really, really difficult. And it's a topic I care a lot about. And like if we don't have people change their attitudes around how we talk about sustainability and how we actually do sustainability, we ain't gonna have a lot left. The JavaScript world is a very extreme version of what we have in the desktop Linux world. They are our end game if something doesn't change. I hope something changes because I don't want that end game.
With all that being said, I do think there is still a place there for, like, I don't want to see a world where everything in the open source world becomes it has to be monetized to use. Like, I still think there is a place, because there are, for people out there who are, in developing nations, they don't have that much time or money, but they need some sort of computing system. And I think there is absolutely a place for those people to get a good computing experience entirely for free, where otherwise they just simply wouldn't be able to have one.
Well, sure. Look, I would just love for us to get to the 80-20 rule when it comes to being able to pay things.
Sure.
Pay for things. If 20% of the people that actually use this stuff pay for it, that's amazing. Right now, that is not the case.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's like less than 1%, maybe.
I'd be surprised if it was even 1% for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
you
And
have
so
standout projects for sure, but like your general
the
projects, definitely.
no. Right. Like if we approach if we got to like the 80/20 rule started applying to open source stuff, that would be fantastic. I agree with you. Like as a kid, like there was no way I was going to be able to afford any of the stuff that I'm doing. Like, but if I had the free access to a compiler, the free access to Emacs and open source software and Linux, that changed my life.
Mhm.
And I know that it changes the lives of other people all over the world. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this.
Right.
So, because like the reason I'm doing this is to pay it forward. It changed my life. It made my career. I became very successful for and I want other people to have the opportunity for that success. And so I want to pay it forward, and that's how I do it. So I don't want to say that it should be 100% monetized for all the things that if you can't afford it, then you're SOL. No, but there should always be affordable tier contribution options with money. There should always be high-end tier contribution options with money, and there should always be freely available tier where you have the opportunity to contribute with effort, time, advocacy, all this other stuff.
I think one of the problems that a lot of projects face is finding a way to, like, obviously the development side, that's easy. Like, have a repo there, people can support with code. But I find a lot of projects just don't really know how to bring the money. Like, they'll usually have, like, we have GitHub sponsors, we have a Patreon, we have this, we have that. But, like, you don't, if you just download something from your repos, you're probably not going to go check out the GitHub or check out anything else. It's like, you need some, maybe, like, something in your about section in the app. Just a lot of projects just simply don't have a clear way on how you can support the project in the app itself.
I think it's because we don't have a normalized pattern of how to introduce an application to people. So one of the things that I'm happy that both Gnome and Plasma started doing is having these welcome wizards for their desktops. Now, I don't know if you've seen it recently for KDE Plasma. In Fedora KDE, this is enabled, and you can check it out now. As you go through it, it actually tells you about KDE V. It gives you a link to donate and things like that. Like Conky is shown. They have a fun message about it and everything. GNOME doesn't have an equivalent in GNOME Tour. Although, admittedly, I don't know if it would even help because, again, GNOME Foundation didn't pay for anything other than the infrastructure. But, they could do stuff like that. It's always possible. Most applications, at least from GNOME and KDE, their about dialogues include that information. If they have a wizard of some kind, they'll often have a little sponsor link or whatever. Some bigger applications like OBS Studio have these as well, where they mention it, but we haven't really normalized a pattern that everyone can adopt, that users are expected to see, where they're introduced to the funding side of the house.
Right.
The current shtick going on right now is like, oh, let's put this into FlatHub, and let's have the software centers handle this and whatever. This is super complicated. This is incredibly difficult to do right. And it can actually very easily go wrong. So, I mean, at least FlatHub's now moving to its own legal entity and all that other stuff. But payments processing is a mess. If you're going to be a publisher and a mediator, it's a whole new set of problems. You also have a whole new set of liabilities. Because now you have to actually audit the content.
Yeah.
You have to make sure there's a whole lot of extra things. And let me tell you right now, some of the people that are running this stuff, they feel that they don't need to do any of that sort of thing. And I promise you, they definitely do.
See, look, this is what YouTube thought, what Twitch thought in the early days. Go back to 2007 YouTube, where it's like, music videos, re-upload, whatever, do whatever you want. Movies, fine.
All it took was a few lawsuits and everything changed.
Yeah. You get away with it until you get a little bit too big. Then you stop getting away with it.
Yep. It's a challenging problem, but it's also one that so My gut feel about it is that FlatHub and GNOME aren't motivated to really solve this problem because most of their developers are paid, and most of their developers work for large companies that could not care.
Right.
Or if they do care, they care in a very specific way that doesn't really matter for the general case.
Mm-hmm.
In the KDE side, it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? Like there's a lot of people that do volunteer stuff. There's a bigger mix of volunteer versus paid. But there's also like a coherency problem. Like, how do we have a defined vision for how we want to handle this? And ultimately, like, for better or worse, some of the stuff that we're doing in KDE, like around Flatpaks and stuff like that, we're totally dependent on what GNOME chooses to do too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because FlatHub's effectively run by GNOME, so is the Flatpak project. Upstream, while the Upstream project is kind to KDE, the main folks who work on that project are all GNOME people. And so there's all like the set of concerns, and there's really not that many people outside of the GNOME and KDE camps even doing anything at all in this space to figure this out. And so that makes things even more difficult. Like, for example, I don't know what the heck's up with Mate. I don't know what. Like, I know Clem's doing his shtick with Cinnamon, but I don't know how that's going to go either.
What do you mean? Like, what do you mean about that?
Well, so Clem's shtick with Cinnamon is like Linux Mint.
Right.
Is essentially like it lives off of sponsorships and donations from people. And they've got a lot of it because they've been doing it for so long. So they've got their own funding thing going on based on that. Mate, I have no idea what they're doing. I also haven't seen anything come out of them in a while, and I'm a little worried about them.
I know Mate was like, I know they're working on Wayland stuff, so clearly they're doing something.
Yeah, sure. They're working on something. I don't. I think the goal is that XFCE 4.20 is going to ship with a Wayland session. That's their blocker right now.
I've read the roadmap.
I know what you're thinking.
Look, I'm
it's
sure
that's coincidence.
Oh, I didn't even notice that.
There you go. You get to break down properly now.
God damn it. No, I didn't know. I look, I'll be impressed if XFCE ships a Wayland compositor.
So they're like halfway through a port of XFWM4 to be back
they're
based
further
on
than I thought they were.
Yeah, so like all the other stuff's done. Like they ported all the panels and the file manager and all that stuff to run on on Wayland. They just don't have a compositor, and they've been working on it for a couple of years now.
I think Mate's in a similar position. Like all of their apps work on Wayland.
Are done. They just don't have a compositor. Well, no, Mate, they haven't ported the panel yet to Wayland yet, but all the other stuff is done. Yes. So XFCE is slightly further ahead, but they just haven't got they haven't gotten their XFWM4, I think is what it's called, the XFCE window manager. That thing is like halfway through a port to Wayland. They're using WL roots for it, and they've just been reworking it so that it can also run as a Wayland compositor. For Mate, oh gosh, a long time ago, their strategy was to adopt Mir. And then the guy who was like running that effort like left Canonical, and so I don't know what's going on.
I always forget that Mir existed. What a fun time.
Well, I mean, Mate adopting Mir is the reason why I have it in Fedora, because I put it there for them so that they would be able to have a compositor. Because their rule is that they want to use something that supported multiple distributions.
Right.
I like the Mir guys; they're nice people. And so I packaged up their software for Fedora, and it's been in Fedora since I think like 27 or something like that. It's been there for a while. Nobody knows it's there, I guess, but it's been there for a while. It was there so that the Mate people would be okay with adopting it because Martin Wimpress, that was it. He was the Ubuntu Mate guy. He was working with the Mir team to develop a Wayland compositor for Ubuntu Mate, and that was going to be part of the Mate project using Mir. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened after he left Canonical, so I don't know what they're going to do.
RPM's Mia created 5 years ago, maintained by Neal Gompa.
Yeah.
Jesus. Well, hey, if for some reason someone wants to use that, go. It's there. It's on Fedora 40.
Yeah, it's there. It's been there for a while. It's even mentioned in the official Mir documentation that I think nobody reads.
I don't want to be too mean to Mir, but like there was a world where Mir was going to be important, and then it stopped being
Here we are.
important. But
they're nice people.
Yeah.
So like, and they actually participate in the Wayland community directly a little bit, not as much as I would like, but they do it. So I give props to them. They're at least trying.
I think the only of the like not major desktops that are like have a clear vision for Wayland is Budgie. Like Budgie is very much on the way to getting Wayland ready.
Yes. Well, yeah, I know. I sit in their stand-ups.
Of course
every week.
you do. Of course you do.
I help them. I helped Josh Strobel make Fedora Budgie in the first place.
Why am I not? Why am I not? Like, I just bring up anything in this phase. I'm like, I started it. Like, I'm there from the start. Like, what do you? I can't talk about anything with you without you just already being involved in some way.
Look, I'm not involved in any Debian things as far as I know right now. So there you go.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. You're involved in Debian by what do you call it? Rule of transitivity. You're involved in GNOME stuff that's in Debian. There you go. You're involved
not GNOME stuff so much.
KDE stuff, yeah. You will occasionally comment on an issue on the GNOME issue tracker.
Yes, I am. I do that. I exist as a comment in there. I have upstreamed a couple of patches to GNOME before, but I personally find engaging with the GNOME project broadly. I mean, there are specific people where I'm okay with, but like broadly speaking, I find engaging with GNOME frustrating. So sometimes it's just, like the way I view how computers should, how computing and open source computing should be thought about, and the way that several GNOME folks think about it is they don't necessarily fully align.
Right.
I'm happy to help them out when I need to, or support them in the context of Fedora Workstation. It's just the broader way that GNOME thinks about things and the way I think about things just don't match up. And so it's just hard for me on that front. But KDE and I, we get along great, so I do a lot there.
I certainly hear people often mentioning this about GNOME, and there's no need to mention any like specific names, but do you have any examples of like things that are like that don't align in that regard for you?
Not particularly off the bat that would not point to someone specifically, so I don't really want to go there.
No, that's fair.
But like I will say this, like I feel like GNOME as a project is commercially successful but not community successful. They've got I would like to see the GNOME Foundation take community engagement and support much more seriously, and I would like to see GNOME Foundation reports at GWADEC start including community engagement and perception metrics and measuring the general attitude people have in GNOME and people outside of GNOME towards it. Because I feel like whether it's perception or reality about whether GNOME is a good or bad or whatever project, there is clearly a huge mismatch, and that's not okay. Like, sure, and KDE's looked at like a darling. I mean, KDE's not perfect either, and I think they'll be first to admit that they're not perfect. But GNOME's reputation is not in a place that I would be proud of. I would not be happy with that. And like, if I was a community manager, I would be like, this needs to be fixed. This needs to improve. We can't have people saying that things like GNOME is all about taking away features and making life difficult for everyone and changing everything all the time, and like or calling people rejects and stuff like that. Like you can't. That's not okay. None of that is okay. Officially, GNOME has a code of conduct which doesn't allow any of this. So why do people keep saying that this is a thing, and this is a problem? And whether it's perception or reality, the perception is reality, and it needs to improve. I would really like to see GNOME do something about it.
Well, even with the code of conduct, I don't think most of it is like GNOME people just being straight up mean. I think it's more like GNOME has they have an approach they want to take, and that is the approach they are taking. Like a recent example that I saw was for an entire year, the accent color portal was completely stalled because there was this discussion about should we have arbitrary colors in the portal or named colors, and there was a GNOME member involved in the thread who was basically just saying, like, GNOME is not doing arbitrary. It's just not going to happen. Like, we are doing named colors, or it's just not going to happen on GNOME. And the thread basically just completely stalled arguments about, like, how it should be done. And eventually did get merged. Before it got merged, like, someone just came in and was like, why are you letting GNOME dictate what the other desktops are going to be doing? Like, if GNOME wants to have a restrictive environment, like, they should be allowed to do it. Like, they're making their desktop, but that shouldn't be limiting, like, what all these other desktops are doing. Like, just screw GNOME. Like, we're just going to do this, and they're going to play ball, or we don't care. So, like,
nobody wants a repeat of the status notifier item situation.
That's why. I don't happen to know that one.
You might know it by the commercial name that Canonical gave it, which was App Indicators.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Every desktop implements the SNI spec except for GNOME.
Mm-hmm.
Every one. Guess what? This sucks. Because people are writing applications that don't work on GNOME at all.
Mm-hmm.
And like applications using SNI is only increasing because people are now writing Electron apps, or they're writing Flutter apps, and these things are cross-platform. And guess what? Every platform except for GNOME, Linux, Windows, Mac, have an equivalent to that thing, and they all use it, sometimes for very critical functions. So we're in this situation now where the dominant desktop, by virtue of it being on the enterprise Linuxes and on Ubuntu, doesn't implement a core feature that a lot of application developers actually need for their apps to work. Nobody wants a repeat of that situation ever again.
Mm-hmm.
So, and GNOME knows this.
Mm-hmm.
Like the GNOME community people that are engaging on this, they know they have the upper hand in that regard, and that is why they can talk that way, because they know that ultimately something isn't going to land if GNOME doesn't agree to it, because GNOME is the dominant desktop.
Right.
Like, yes, it's a dominant desktop in a small market share by inside of an even smaller market share, inside of an even smaller market share, but in the space of the tiniest of puddles, it is a big fish in it. So
they are very big plankton.
Yes, they're very big plankton. Yep. But like speaking of the App Indicator stuff, right? Like within Fedora Workstation, I kind of got fed up about the fact that 2 jobs ago, I was in a workplace where we had core applications that are required on our computers that only function through App Indicators. Like they don't have a window. They run as background applications. Not having support for that meant that the desktop was effectively unusable.
Mm-hmm.
So I got fed up and I was like, we have to fix this in Fedora Workstation. And I outlined this and I said, these are the core things that people depend on. They have to use it. They don't have a choice that only fully work when you have SNI support.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, logic wins eventually. And they tacitly agreed that they were going to put it in there. but they didn't want to do the existing spec. They wanted a new one. And so there's a free desktop thing about a replacement for status notifier item.
Status notifier item.
Under the SDG specs. Yeah, so update the status notifier item system tray spec on the free desktop GitLab.
Notifier. Spec. Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool.
It is also stalled for basically because of.
Of course it is.
Yes, it's stalled because of. Yeah, you can look through it yourself and you can see, but it is.
Oh my
stalled.
god! Why is the thread so long?
It is. I'm just saying, it is stalled. The thread gets longer if you go to the merge request that's linked to it.
God, okay. This is such a mess.
189 comments in the first one, and it's a lot.
8 months ago. Oh, Aura's here. Wow. Aura's everywhere.
Yeah, I don't know quite what's up with Dallas, but she shows up everywhere. So
yeah.
Everywhere GNOME-centric, anyway.
Yeah, Aura's one of my... I actually didn't realize, but, like, yeah, Aura's one of the Discord mods. I didn't realize it showed up everywhere else as well. This is I might have to go read this thread afterwards. This just
it's
seeing
special.
Just seeing how long you scroll, which always indicates it's going to be a fun thread.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it kicks in Firefox's nice smooth scrolling tells you that this is going to be a long one.
So, what exactly is the deal here then? It's just in a TLDR.
TLDR. GNOME wants the specification to be restricted to what GNOME Shell already does, which is not a lot.
Yep, that sounds about right. Okay.
And everyone else needs it to do just slightly more.
Right. Yeah, that's typically how it goes. Yeah, okay.
There were actually some points that they brought up that were quite reasonable, and there were some points that even I brought up. Like, there was one person who's like, "Oh, we want to support raster images." I'm like, "No, no. We have worked 20 years to get out of using XPMs and PNGs and GIFs in these things. We are not. It has to be SVG. I am very sorry you are not getting raster stuff." Because we need this to scale with high DPI and all these other things.
Yep.
It's just all kinds of stuff like that. It's like, oh, we want to be able to draw our own widgets and stuff. Like, no. Just no. We're not replicating Xembed here. There's like a whole host of not gonna do it here. So it's been interesting in that front, but like it's stalled. I'm not happy about the fact that it's stalled. I wanted this fixed a year ago, and I really didn't feel like this needed to go through this kind of mess. But here we are, stalled, and everyone is unhappy because it is stalled.
Oh my god! So, like, if you look at the Linux desktop just, like, casually, it all looks like it all flows together really well. But when you start...
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
If you just look at it, like, with your eyes half open, it looks like it works.
I think it needs to be quarter open. It needs to be quarter open.
But, like, the further you look into this, the more you... I think the big part of it is the fact that it is just individuals doing what individuals want to do. There are these big entities that have their specific goals, but it's not like, okay, Windows, right? If Microsoft wants to get something done, they're going to get it done. Like, they're going to have a plan. There's going to be managers telling people what to do. Here it's like, here's 12 different factions that are all trying to get their own little slight difference. One of them's a lot bigger than everyone else's that has a completely different opinion, but nobody can just agree on even some of the most basic, like, this is as dumb as the accent color thing. Like, it's such a basic thing. I don't understand why we can't agree on this.
I was gonna say that, and then I realized that you were frozen when I was gonna say it. It's like, oh crap, this is. I was gonna say that like Gnome's incentive structure around this is interesting because remember I said that they were commercially successful, but not necessarily community successful.
Right.
So the commercial successful is interesting because everyone that's paying them doesn't care what Gnome does. Which leads to a very weird set of incentives. They can do almost whatever they want with some degree of impunity when it comes to this. They're going to get paid, because for example, in both Rel and Sled, there's not a direct driver of like this has to be a certain UX experience. They don't really care enough to drive that from a product perspective. So that they're not using that input to do anything meaningful. So the developers basically get to do what they feel like, and then they're paid, and the companies just accept whatever it is, and they continue to ship it. There's, on one hand, that looks great. That's generally trust, but on the other hand, it also means there's no accountability.
Right.
So, because of that, you get to these kinds of deadlock situations, and there is not a super strong incentive for them to do something about it, not positively, unless something else, some other factor happens that changes the dynamics there. Nothing changes, and that's really why, like, I would like to see Gnome Foundation to step up as like someone who, as an overseer of the GNOME project, should actually do something in that respect.
So as it stands right now, it's sort of the only way that something like status notifier, whatever it was, the only way something like that changes is if you have like corporate pressure trying to like make that happen. Then someone's possibly going to be like, hey, we actually need this now. Like, it doesn't really matter like what you guys want as a project. This needs to happen.
Well, so it's more like the incentives have to align so that they care.
Right.
I think it's fine that Gnome's vision of how it should work should be part of the discussion. That absolutely makes sense.
I think for 99% of things, that's fine. Do it like
the problem is that if they're ultimately not interested or incentivized to care about making this land even within something that fits within GNOME as well as the rest of the desktops, then it doesn't go anywhere. I'm not necessarily saying that, like, okay, a company like Red Hat or SUSE is like, we need this in our thing, so you got to go represent our interests and make us, do the, the XYZ thing. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that they should have people recognize, that this is important to us. We will accept a solution. We will accept any solution for this that you guys can come up with, but it's got to be something that everyone agrees on, that application developers can adopt. Because if you can't do that, then this is no good to us either. And that's the parameters I want them to have. And to be fair, right, like that is essentially the parameters that this spec is operating under. The condition for this to even work is that both GNOME and KDE have to agree to adopt it. If both are willing to agree to adopt it, then everybody else will, and the ecosystem will adapt quickly. But if we can't get that, then the status quo is effectively going to carry forward, and there's no point in developing a new spec.
Right.
So that's why I'm real sad about this being stalled, because in principle, the GNOME shell developers have agreed to implementing a new spec. They just won't implement the old one, the current one. But getting that spec in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Man, it's been 2 years at this point for me. It's like I will die on this hill. I want applications to actually work.
Oh,
on
what
every
a crazy
desktop.
hill to die on.
you'd be surprised.
Yeah.
You'd be very surprised. There are some people who say I would rather certain apps just be broken and not look good and not functional because I don't like I don't like their mere existence because a choice they made in life. And I'm like, no.
I've had that. As YouTube's top Wayland propagandist, as defined by Boycott Wayland, I've very much had... Yes.
Wow, that's a thing?
Wait, have you never heard of Boycott Wayland?
No.
Okay. So you know who Pro Bono is, right? The app image developer.
Oh, okay, now I know. I'm done. I got it. I got it. I know. I met him in person. I've done. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So he also has.
I'm done.
Here's a GitHub gist is what it called. I don't know. He's got a thing on GitHub called Boycott Wayland. It's this giant list of a lot of outdated information. It says,
and it's his nitpick.
My favorite thing. So I've got two favorite things. One, screen capture doesn't work. It's worked for years. We've got Pipewire. My second favorite thing is all of the tools on there where it's like, this tool doesn't work, and it's like an X configuration tool. Like, X render doesn't work. X clip doesn't work. Like, do you know what the X means in its name?
No. No, I don't.
Like, what do you... Yeah. No shit, it doesn't... If you go to a Volkswagen key, it's not going to open the Subaru. Like, yeah, that's the point. They're not the same thing.
I'm very glad that somebody decided to not call this X12. That would have made this so much worse.
I wish they did. That would have been so great.
No. I am very happy they picked a different name for this.
It would have... Honestly, half the arguments I see... It's not even arguing about the merits of it. It's like, this is not, like... It's like... How do I even describe it? Half the arguments I see for why Wayland is bad are so stupid. But I feel like some of them at least would be alleviated if there's a clear continuation. Because I've made it clear to people that a lot of the people working on Wayland today used to work on X. But no, it's Wayland, so it's a different thing. If it was called X12, at least there would be like that clear continuation of the line. Obviously,
here's the flip side of that argument.
Okay.
The total protocol breakage and everything being completely different and nothing being compatible would have made X12 an even worse name. Because everyone would have expected it to be a backwards compatible upgrade.
Okay, that's fair. I guess because we've had X11 for 30 years, and there were like X8, X9, X10, things like that, but they exist.
There's an old library that was only retired a few years ago that was archived that was literally putting X10 applications on top of X11. There hasn't been an X10 application released in 30 years.
Yeah, X10 didn't become like a public widespread project till X11. Why did that exist?
There were earlier versions of the X protocol.
There were, yeah, I know. They existed over the span of like 2 years, though. Like at this stage, I don't use Wayland on my system just because I've had issues with video. Most of my problems with Wayland are related to video production-y stuff. Like, the way I like to describe sort of the state of Wayland now is Wayland is great if you can ignore the giant gaping holes, and a regular person is going to go down the middle of the road and they're not going to see any of the holes. They're not going to be doing any of the weird edge cases where things do still break. I do. That's the problem. Like, I want to use Wayland, and the experience I've had is great for my normal computing experience. But there are those edge cases where it is still a problem. But I think a lot of people see those edge cases being a problem and then assume that's going to be applying to most of their experience. Like, if you've not used Wayland in whether it's GNOME, whether it's KDE, if you've not used in like 3 or 4 years, try it out I guarantee the experience is going to be so much better than you've heard it's going to be. Like, there are issues with Nvidia, absolutely. There are issues with certain with, especially if you start getting into like the more window manager environments, there's certainly issues there. But if you're using GNOME or KDE, the experience is going to be mostly good enough. Maybe you have some issues with accessibility stuff. That's a totally different issue, and that is something that does definitely need to be addressed. But if that's not the case, try it out. Just see what it's like. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't have anything else to add to that.
I'll say, though, that I vastly prefer the KDE Plasma experience on Wayland than I do the GNOME one.
Okay.
Because there's more protocol implementation. The Quinn compositor seems to do stuff a lot better. There
is a lot of collaboration between WL-Roots and Quit. Yes,
I know.
You have the. It's every step of the way. It's like, hey, look, KDE's working with the community. GNOME's doing their thing. Every single step of the way.
I mean, to be fair, right? The GNOME people also, they propose protocols. They do the process and stuff. And they are participating in discussions and stuff. It's just, yeah, well. And they're doing important things too, right? Like the Red Hat folks are working on HDR protocols, and they're largely leading that effort. And that's GNOME people, but they are working with KDE people. They're working with WL-Roots people. Like the important stuff is definitely being worked out by everyone. But you know how we talked about stalling? That happens a lot in the Wayland protocol stuff too. And it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily GNOME people, but there's a lot of stalling that goes on. Like there are protocols here. I'm looking at the GitLab project right now. There's merge requests for new protocols that are years old. It makes me sad.
Yeah, but look, what are you going to do?
I try to pretend it's not a thing until I have to deal with it. That's pretty much the only way to be happy here.
Well, look, your effort is, rather than getting in these threads that are just stalled forever, your effort is a lot better spent on things where you can actually get the ball moving, where you can actually make a difference, where there's no complaints about the direction it's going. There's no issue with fixing this problem. It's just, okay, it's a problem. We fix it. Good. It's upstreamed, and now we can propagate it out. Everyone's day is better now.
I want that to be happening more often, though.
Yeah.
There's so... It's just I'm going to use the word. It's basically politics, right? It's just open source politics. It's a lot of politicking. It's a lot of dealing with people, figuring out how to do compromises and stuff like that. It's not glamorous. It's not cool. It's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, whenever you have people together, like, you're always going to run into politics like that. Like, you're always going to have different groups trying to struggle over power, different people trying to show off their leadership skills. Like, no matter what happens, like, we can always think we're better in the open source space, but we're not. We're really not. It's just
the only difference is you can see it all.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Rather than it happening with, like, we have weird middle managers fighting over who's going to run this project. Here it's just, hey, it's all on the mailing list. It's all on the GitLab. It's all on the Matrix, whatever communication platform's being used. And it's just all available to see. And I guess you'd hope that'd be used as like a learning experience for others. So it's not repeated again and again and again and again. But, well, yeah, it's not what happens.
Yeah, it takes a hot minute.
Yeah, we just get lots of examples of it just happening. You know what? Let's be positive. Let's be positive about the FOSS world. What's some happy things we can talk about?
Well, Plasma 6 is coming.
It is, yeah.
I'm very excited about KDE Plasma 6. From the Fedora perspective, this is I am crossing my fingers that that I can make Fedora be the first distribution to ship it. I really want to be that. I like being first. But also I'm just genuinely excited about what's been going on with KDE Plasma. This is not a let's break everything and change all the stuff. This is very much a refinement release. We're porting everything to Qt 6, but we're also, looking at the whole experience and doing things to align more and make it so that things fit better. It's a lot of spit, shine, and polish and that sort of thing. And I'm very happy that that's what we're doing, because we don't need to break everything and change everything all over again. We already did that once with Plasma 4, and that didn't go so well. And Plasma 5 and Plasma 5 was a step in the right direction. And I think continuing on that path with Plasma 6 is going to be great. I'm super excited about the massive improvements to Plasma Wayland that are going to come with Plasma 6. It's a big part of it, and I'm very excited. And as you're probably aware, Fedora KDE is the first distribution to use Plasma Wayland by default, and it's been using it for 2-ish years now.
I actually wasn't aware of that.
Well, okay. Yeah, no, if you go look it up, Plasma Wayland by default, Fedora 34.
Well, I'm not surprised they're using it by default. I just didn't realize they were the first.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really cool. Wayland by default.
Offhand,
we go 2021.
Yeah. Offhand, I think in
name is on the thing. Why is your name on every single Fedora change?
It's not on every single Fedora change, but I will say that I have my name on at least one Fedora change every release since Fedora 26.
Okay. To be fair, you are directory placer, so it does make sense that you're involved in the change.
Yes.
Okay, maybe there's some obvious. Yeah, that okay. I'll let that one pass.
Obvious is obvious. Yes.
Yeah, I'll let that one pass.
But let's see here. I lost my train of thought. That's all right. That's fine. It's okay.
What is the big improvement that's happening on the Wayland KDE side with Plasma 6?
Well, really, just the upgrade to Qt 6 is going to be enough in itself, because the KDE folks have done a lot of work in Qt upstream to make it better on Wayland environments. Wayland has become a bigger focus for the Qt group as well as for KDE. Automotive stuff, embedded stuff, a lot of this that does it on Linux, they're doing it with Weston with IVI shell, but they're also sometimes making their own compositors, or they're doing their own thing. But they're also running, they want to run Wayland applications well. So there's a lot going on there. And we're going to benefit from that, from Qt. And I'm very excited about that.
Well, I've talked about maybe, because I've never actually properly sat down and daily drove KDE in. I've been thinking about maybe I'll have to try it out when 6 comes out.
Come on with Fedora, KDE. We're best.
Yeah, but I like my broken as hell Arch system. It's content. Whenever it breaks, it's content. I need a system that's not stable.
Fine, whatever.
I've said before that if I
you could definitely have a broken system by running Fedora Rawhide. If you'd like that, that's your way to do it. You're going to get everything as it comes, and good luck with that. That's probably the way to go.
I've said before that when I eventually whenever it happens. Eventually set up my capture PC. I'll probably just throw Fedora on it because I'm not gonna install Arch on a capture PC. That's stupid.
I know people do crazy things.
Yeah.
But like, so actually now I remember what I was going to say. It's like, so Fedora was the first to do Plasma Wayland, and a year later, Chaos Linux, KAOS, they're a KDE only distribution. They actually switched to Plasma Wayland by default too.
Wow.
And then earlier this year, Fedora 38, we are now Wayland all the way from login to shutdown, because we changed the display manager SDDM to Wayland. So we are now not using X for anything in Fedora KDE other than to run X11 applications.
Wow.
On a Wayland session. So that's at this point we are actually comparable to GNOME on that front. So
that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, we're the only distro that's at that level, but and I'm not resting on our laurels. I want us to push forward faster, further, and I intend to do a lot more around that as much as I can.
What are the big areas to be focused on right now?
So really multimedia has been my thing right now, like dealing with multimedia stuff. Like Fedora, Linux distributions in general have a very poor multimedia story, and improving that has been something that I've been poking at for the past few years. I helped bring FFmpeg into Fedora, which has unlocked a huge trove of applications to be able to bring into the distribution. OBS Studio, which I've started contributing to the OBS project as well, because of that, and a bunch of other things related on that front, like being able to make it better for, like, my personal goal is to make it better for game devs and other creatives, and that's like where I'm seeing the if you talk about product market fit and all those kinds of businessy terms, that's kind of where I'm going with this. So I started a couple of years ago working on game dev stuff with SDL and having to improve things on that front, getting everything shifting over to Wayland by default for games on Linux is also an aspect that I'm going to do, because we don't want kind of like the most important visual thing to be stuck on a legacy technology. And so that's a bit of what I've been doing. And then the adjacent to that is like, oh, how do we deal with content creation and media production? And now that I do a podcast with the Pseudo Show and all that other stuff, like, and I need to be able to do that stuff too.
Yeah. And
so like I am focusing a lot. I'm focusing a lot on that, trying to get the creative stuff in place. Like Kden Live is now in Fedora. OpenShot is now in Fedora. We're looking through like getting all these other things and tools and stuff, like, because the multimedia situation is improving so rapidly in Fedora, we're getting to a point where maybe some point in the near future, there might be even a Fedora creators lab. And that would just be like preloaded with or like an equivalent, like Fedora, like something more like what Fedora Jam does for audio, except for video. And then maybe another one for game creation and game development. Like, I want to enable people to build these like opinionated collections to promote open source technologies for doing real things in not just IT spaces. Because when you get the enthusiasts and you get the gamers and you get the professional creatives, that's the next stage. That's like how you get the next step of growth and success, both for community and professional Linux. Like, I want to see that happen, because I think that's how you get to the next stage of growth and adoption. Because we've already got the developer types. The developers love Linux. We got to get everyone else too, and we got to take that step by step.
Well, it sounds like that's coming along well then. Like I wasn't aware of what was being done on Fedora in that regard. Like, as I said, I look at Fedora a lot from the outside. So when there's like some big change on the wiki, there's some like big threat, like that's something I'll usually see. But these like day-to-day operational changes and introduction to new packages, like this is something I've not been aware of happening on that front. But it is awesome to hear that like everything is getting better there.
Yep. I mean, I do Fedora changes for a lot of the bigger things, but also like I'm not shy about the stuff that we're doing on this front. I talk about them whenever I give talks at the Fedora release parties or at Flock or whatever. Right? Fedora Asahi Remix is another step towards that. The creative types tend to own Macs. Either they've had them historically or they've had them because of their job or whatever. Giving them an opportunity to use Linux on that hardware is a big deal, and it gives them an opening. And so I look at it from that perspective, like what is there to enable here, and what this is to enable is to bring in a new set of people, like either people who have, I fully expect that Apple is going to EOL the first generation Apple Silicon Macs within the next few years. It's been a while. It's been a hot minute now.
How long has it been?
Well, they launched at the end of November 2020, I think. So we're like 2 years into it, and like a couple more years.
We're definitely getting close.
Yeah, like when the M3 chip comes out, do you think that they're going to still hold on to M1 anymore? I don't know. I mean, they've gotten a lot more aggressive about dropping old Apple Macs, like Intel Macs are dropping like flies. And I don't know what their strategy is going to be for ARM Macs. But like, I want to give people the opportunity to have a platform that they can use that in the event that Mac OS can't be updated anymore for their platform. And also, people who have Macs that are being updated, they want to use that hardware with Linux too. I want to give them that opportunity. And I think it's also a great way to just make it so that Linux is available. A good Linux platform is available everywhere.
What is we'll be ending off soonish, but what is the state like as like a top level view? Like, what's Asahi like right now? Like, because I once again, this is another thing where I look at it a lot from the outside. I see these big changes that are being added, but I don't really, see how much it's really improving. Like, to actually use it.
Well, my Apple Silicon Mac is in the other room, so I can't really bring it to show you.
Sure.
It basically works. Like if you don't, as long as you're not dealing with sound or hardware accelerated video or the AI or the neural engine, everything works. I mean, it gets like eight hours of battery life. It's surprisingly not very exciting. It works like you would expect on any other platform. It just happens to run on ARM instead of x86. And Apple Silicon's a weird platform that to boot from, so there's goofiness there. But otherwise, it's just if you've used Fedora in a VM or if you've used Fedora on real hardware on x86, it could be a similar experience on an Apple Silicon Mac.
I think that's the best spot to be in. It's boring. Like,
yeah. The exciting part is that it's boring.
Yeah. Because if boring means it's work, like if it's not working, like hey, that's at least some excitement. Like,
Yeah.
Well, that's honestly like really good to hear then. Like, because I saw the project come along very early on. I was like, this is I was very hopeful. Like, I know there's a lot of people out there who's never gonna happen. Blah blah. Like, people being really skeptical of it. I don't know why. Like, you can look at like the history that Hector's had in this space. Like, Hector's not new.
I've known Hector for years. Because I used to be involved in homebrew communities and in the Sonic scene and Nintendo scenes for making hacked ROMs and and Boot Me and all that other stuff, the homebrew set. Because I had a Wii that I eventually when I got a Wii U and moved playing games to the Wii U, I hacked my Wii because why the hell not? And so like I knew about Hector like and the PlayStation 3 efforts and all this other stuff. So I've known his track record personally. Although before this, he and I hadn't really interacted all that much, but like I knew him. I'd interacted with him briefly from time to time as like some guy who's like saying stuff in an IRC channel or whatever. But like I had all the confidence in him and his team because I've seen him make magic happen before. Also, the man's a bleeding genius. He's like he's actually good at what he does, and he says things that I don't understand. And I have to go look stuff up, and then I realize, oh, okay, got it. Like, so when you're at that level, anything is possible.
Absolutely.
And he's also a nice guy, which is rare for geniuses. At least in my experience. I'm no genius.
Well, on that note, let's end off the show.
All right then.
Where do you want to direct people to? I know you mentioned Pseudo Show before, but do you have a website or a place where people can find it?
So I don't have a website right now. I probably should make one at some point. But
All the things you do, you just don't have a website.
Man, I used to have a website with a blog a long time ago, and then I moved it to Blogger because I didn't want to keep the infrastructure up anymore.
Right.
And I stopped doing blogs because of Twitter, and then and now Twitter's gone because it's gone into a weird place. So now I'm on the Fediverse. So I'm on fosstodon.org/Conan_Kudo. I'm also on GitHub as Conan-Kudo, GitLab as Conan_Kudo, and Gompa on Fedora, Tim on OpenSUSE. There's a bunch of places all over the place you can find me. And I think that's like the primary place people can get in touch with me is on the Fediverse. I think that's pretty much the way to go.
Where can people find Pseudo Show? You skipped over that part.
Right. So I think I need to double check to make sure this URL works because we just got this. I think if you go to tuxdigital.com/pseudo show, that should work. Yes, it does. Sweet. tuxdigital.com/pseudo show will redirect you to the website, to the webpage. So there you go. We also have a YouTube channel. If you want to subscribe, we post to YouTube as well. We have all kinds of other fun video content there. I think if I do youtube.com/pseudo show, you will see it all there.
Awesome.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah, do that. Do that stuff. Are those the only things you want to mention, or is there anything else you want to plug?
I think that's it for now. I don't have anything else.
Okay, awesome. Do my stuff then. So the main channel is Brody Robson. I do Linux videos there 6 days a week. I have no idea what to be out by now because I am way ahead of my schedule. Yeah, no schedule for this.
That's not good.
Not for yeah. So I this will be out in like 2 or 3 weeks, and I have another. Why do I keep doing? I keep saying I'm gonna take a break, and then I record 2 podcasts in a week. Why do I keep doing this?
I don't think that counts as a break.
No, it doesn't. My backlog just keeps getting bigger. What? I don't know why I'm doing this. Whatever. I've got the gaming channel that is Brody on Games on YouTube and Twitch. Also Kick, I guess, because I'm there, because why not? Also DLive, if for some reason you still use DLive. I'm probably still playing through Final Fantasy 16 and Armored Core. So that's fun. And if you're listening to the audio version of this, you can find the video version on YouTube at Tech Over Tea. And if you want to listen to the audio version, pretty much any podcast platform out there, there is an RSS feed as well. Just search Tech Over Tea and you will find it. I'll give you the final word. What do you want to say?
Linux and open source is great. Go check out it. If you've not really tried Fedora, give it a shot again. Fedora KDE is awesome. Fedora Workstation is great too. Give it a shot and enjoy. Have fun.
Awesome. It was a pleasure to have you on. Definitely see this again sometime.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, see you guys later.